All right, looking at what are called the silent years of the life of Jesus. You know, we've been studying the events surrounding the announcement of his birth, John the Baptizer. We've talked about some of the things that pertain to his birth, well, both of them specifically. And we've talked some about the visit of the wise men, or the shepherds, and then the wise men following his birth. We've tried to put together a timeline with respect to about the first 2 or so years of his life. Now, we want to look at for lack of a better term, the escape to Egypt, and some of the things that surround that, and then also looking to his early life. The only record that we have of the early life of Jesus is found in Luke chapter 2, with the account where Jesus and his family are in Jerusalem. And so we basically have, well, not basically, we have nothing about the life of Jesus from age 2 to age 12. Then we have nothing in the life of Jesus from age 12, aside from this singular incident. Nothing about his life from age 12 to, as the Bible says, about 30 years old. The Bible talks about Jesus beginning his ministry when he was about 30 years old. He could have been 27. He could have been 29. He could have been 31. You know, in other words, he was about 30 years old. And so we call these the silent years. So because for, in essence, 28 years, we only have one incident in the life of Jesus as a young man. And so with that in mind, the introduction says, we will cover the first 30 years of Jesus' life in this lesson. And that kind of strikes me as it's interesting because I've mentioned this in other contexts, but 1/3 of all human history is tied up in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. We oftentimes don't think about that. From the creation to the flood is 1,656 years. And so if you figure the earth is about 6,000 years old, which is about the age of the earth based on the genealogies and what we know from the scriptures, that's 1,656 out of 6,000 years is tied up in about the first 10 pages of your Bible. And there's a lot that is said, and yet at the same time there's so little that is said. We don't find basically anything other than a singular chapter drawing Adam's lineage in chapter 5 to Noah. And then Noah's 500, next thing we know, Noah's 500 years old. So it's like one verse to the next, we have skipped 500 years. And so it's not unusual for the Bible to do these types of things, to pass significant or even great periods of time in a very short amount of, for lack of a better term, a lack of ink. All right, and so we don't want to get bogged down in what we don't know, what God didn't choose to tell us. Because when we do those types of things, we can fall into various traps, such as some of the, and there's a mention in this lesson, some of the apocryphal books, the books that obviously do not belong in the canon, in the authoritative body of the scriptures, have all types of fanciful stories about Jesus as a boy. That Jesus working miracles as a boy, turning clay sparrows into live sparrows. Even Jesus as a boy striking another boy dead. That's in the apocryphal, in one of the apocryphal gospels. And so, we don't want to get caught up in what the Bible doesn't say, because if we needed to know these things, God would have told us these things. And so with that in mind, let's start into the introductory paragraph. Speaks to Matthew 2, beginning in verse 13. I want you to open your Bibles there, because there's a word that's used in this text that I want us to think about from both a biblical and a philosophical viewpoint. And Scott, I may require some of your legal expertise on explanation or how this might work in a more modern setting, and I'll explain as we go forward. In the fifth line, the end of the fifth line here in the introduction paragraph, it says, "Then the wise men came." Remember, the wise men came to Herod first and told him about the king. Herod wanted them to come back and tell them where this king was. The wise men were told by an angel not to go back to Herod, so they went out another way. Now, let's look at Matthew 2 and verse number 13 beginning. And that picks up where I just finished reading in the paragraph. They went home another way. Now, verse 13. "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt. Stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived," I want you to focus on that word right there. And you have probably reading a different translation. Whatever word you have is the word I want you to think about. Okay? "Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men." Now, I want to focus first of all on the word deceived. He was deceived by the wise men. Let's see. Scott, you got tricked, don't you? Tricked by the wise men. Anybody got mocked by the wise men? Outwitted by the wise men, mocked by the wise men. Somebody got anything? I think that's all four that I was able to find in all of the standard translations. Tricked is ESV and New American Standard. Outwitted is the Holman Christian Standard, and the NIV. Mocked is the King James and the American Standard. Now, I want us to think about this for a moment. In Matthew 2, when Herod made the statement to the wise men, when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him. And then the text just simply says, and when they had heard him, they went. All right? And so it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong or tell me if you've got another idea about this. It seems to me that there appears to be an agreement on the part of the wise men. In other words, Herod believed those guys were coming back, right? And that's exactly right. They would have had they not been warned not to. But the use of the words there, did the wise men deceive Herod? Did they deceive him? Did they trick him? Did they outwit him? And I think that's the key. Kathy, is that. And by the way, I think the idea. And by the way, one thing you have to understand, the word mocked, as it appears in our Bibles, doesn't mean like to make fun of people. Okay. For example, in Acts 17, when it says, when they heard Paul speak of the resurrection, some mocked. mocked. Now that doesn't mean that they literally insulted Paul, or you understand what I'm saying? The idea of being mocked means they just didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. They found it incredulous. They perhaps even found it foolish, unbelievable, whatever. And so sometimes our words don't always convey the idea that's trying to be conveyed. Because it says some mocked, but others said, "We'll hear you again on this matter." So when they mocked, it means they didn't want to have anything else to hear about it. In other words, this is so dumb, we're not going to listen to it anymore. When Lot went to his sons-in-law to warn them about the impending destruction of Sodom, it says, he appeared to them as one who was mocking. In other words, telling a big tale. So there are nuances that are involved here, and I don't know that there's a singular word here that would describe exactly what happened. They didn't deceive him. I don't think. They didn't keep their word. Now,
I wonder if, like the king that I would think back then would just say, "You're going to do this." I don't figure they responded, but then when they got the higher, instructions or the more.
Yeah, and I was thinking along those same lines, Lisa, that a king would have, Herod would have thought they had mocked him or deceived him or tricked him, insofar as they didn't respect his position enough to keep their word. But now, here's kind of an example, Scott, and I want you to kind of think about this and help me here. A few years ago, I was in town, and I was sitting in an office with a friend of mine, and there was another guy in there that I didn't know, and I was introduced to him, and a proposition of sorts or a request of sorts was made of me to help this man. Okay, we'll just call him Man X. All right, and so this friend of mine has asked me to help Man X do a certain thing or find out some things. Okay, well, trusting the man that's sitting across the desk from me, I agreed to help this man. And I told him, I said, "Look, I'll do whatever I can. I'll do whatever I can to help you." Okay? About 3 days later, in my effort to do exactly what I told this man I was going to do, I found out he was nuts. I mean, he was crazy. Like hallucinating type crazy. I mean, just told the craziest stories about some of the people he was wanting me to help him with. I mean, he connected. Just say how nuts this thing was. He connected some of these people to Tommy Arthur. All right. Y'all remember Tommy Arthur, right? The guy that murdered the people back in the 80s and then got out of jail for some reason, and not long after he got out of jail, he murdered some other people. I think didn't the state finally manage to execute him after about 35 years or something like that? Yeah, I mean, it was just, but what he told about this down the road was just so phenomenally nuts. I couldn't go on helping this guy. In fact, when I dealt with some of the people he was wanting me to deal with, it scared them to death. That scared them to death. They didn't want anything to do with this guy. And of course, then I found out why. He's nuts. Now, I saw that guy later, and he accused me of lying to him. But did I lie to him? Did I deceive him? Did I trick him? No. Now, Scott, how would this work in a legal sense when a person enters into an agreement
But the situation is not as it was, like in Herod's case. The situation wasn't as it was presented to be, and an agreement was entered into. All right, so from a legal standpoint, the wise men would have been in a safe position once it was discovered that Herod didn't have any, because what did Herod say he wanted to do? He wanted to worship Jesus. What did he intend to do? Kill Jesus. So that's gonna have a real bearing on whether or not the wise men would be liable for deception or trickery or whatnot.
Well, actually, you were the one who would live.
Right. And so, and like in my case, Scott, let's just say in my case, just kind of thinking about it, if it comes out later on that the guy that's enlisted my help, I mean, like we didn't sign a contract or anything, it was just a verbal agreement, but I try to treat my verbal agreements like they're binding contracts, like every Christian should. But, how would that work in my case? Okay, no, yeah, probably pretty safe. Okay, so
Put the contract in once that alternate notice that it discovered.
I think that's probably right. Or the fact that one person who entered into the agreement is probably not mentally fit to do so.
Well, it was misrepresented.
Well, here's the thing. I think that guy actually believed a lot of the crazy stuff he was telling me.
But here's the thing, if they are crazy, you can't fix crazy.
Right.
In their eyes, you're not gonna change them.
So you're saying crazy's like stupid? Can't be fixed?
Your agreement was to do all you could to help him, and you found out real quick there wasn't nothing you were gonna be able to do that was gonna help him anyway.
I hadn't thought about that, Jeremiah, but you're exactly right. What I had intended to do and what I agreed to do ultimately wouldn't have been any help to him, and it would have been to the harm of somebody else. So it just, the idea, when I was reading this morning, when it said tricked, deceived, it just made me, but then I got to thinking, what word would, in other words, how would Matthew say this from a reasonable person's standpoint without having to explain, like use 4 or 5 sentences to explain, how all this came to pass. And so I think it's probably just that Matthew speaks of this from Herod's perspective. Herod, in other words, when Herod saw that he was mocked, what it means is Herod understood. In other words, he believed he'd been mocked. He believed he'd been deceived. He believed he'd been tricked. You see, the word saw there just simply means to understand or believe a thing. And so I think that I'm not trying to cast any doubt on the integrity of the text. I'm just trying to explain to you how I think it's right to use that terminology under those situations without having to go into a lengthy explanation, which the Bible doesn't want to go into lengthy explanations about tiny things. So I'm thinking it's just from Herod's perspective. All right, any other thoughts or ideas, comments on that? All right, the second paragraph, the flight to Egypt and the slaughter, what's known as the slaughter of the innocents. By the way, you can find this online. I may have mentioned this. There are a number of magnificent tapestries in the Vatican Museum. And I'm talking about giant tapestries. And one of those tapestries is a tapestry of Herod's slaughter of the innocents. And I mean, that thing's hundreds of years old. And it's an incredible depiction of what it might have looked like when this took place. I encourage you, all you got to do is look it up. Just look up Slaughter of the Innocents, Vatican Museum. And you'll see some really vivid, we'll call it artwork, of that particular event. In the middle of that first paragraph, it talks about, it says, Matthew 2:16 makes us believe that the star appeared around 12 months earlier based on Herod's calculations and the understanding of the wise men. And then prior to that, it talks about how Jews would have reckoned the idea of 2 years. We all understand that Jews counted days beginning with the day that they were in. In other words, when Esther said, let's pray about this thing for 3 days. Well, then the very next verse says, and on the third day, which means the day that it was announced, the next day, and the third day. And when Jesus said he'd be, he'd rise after 3 days, didn't mean that he was going to have to be in the tomb 72 hours. The day that he died, Saturday, the break of dawn on Sunday, probably gets him to less, well under 30 hours, I believe, if I remember correctly. So, in that sense, 30 hours can constitute 3 days because the 30 hours takes up a section of three different days. And so, but one thing I want to make mention of in Matthew 2:16, and we mentioned this in our last class session. There's nothing in the text. There's nothing in the text that demands that the star had to appear after Jesus was born. Remember we talked about how those men potentially could have come from hundreds of miles away? There's nothing in the text that demands that the star appeared after Jesus was born. It just simply says, we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. So that star may have well been revealed to them well before Jesus ever made his appearance on this earth. In other words, the appearance of the star gave them a head start to get there. And so I don't think there's anything in the text that demands, and I don't even think it indicates that. That's just a point of disagreement on how that works out. But then I wanted to go down to the bottom half of this paragraph with the slaughter of the innocents, because these are the types of things that really bother a lot of people, and I don't mean unduly so. The question, why did God get Jesus out of Bethlehem and leave all the others to be killed? Those are valid questions, right? They're valid questions, and they're questions that can be troubling to us. And I think there's a great section here and some things to think about. Consider that Herod had free moral choice, Satan has free moral choice, and God has a sovereign will. So God is always just, righteous, and long-suffering in everything he does. And God's judgments always have the best interests of man in mind. So our answer to this question must include all three wills: Herod's will, Satan's will, and God's sovereign will. And so, here's how I would answer this question. Why didn't God protect those other babies? Well, the question would then be, does man have free will? And the answer is yes, man does have free will. Now, with the exercise of free will comes the possibility that people will exercise that free will in a way that is contradictory to God's will. Right? So, what kind of world would we live in if every time somebody wanted to exercise their free will in a way that contradicted God's will, and then God intervened?
That is
Oh yeah, yeah. From a spiritual standpoint,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's not earthly. That's a very minor response for somebody to ask, well, why do you think there's not?
right? I mean, obviously, because we understand the nature of man, that children are born, they're innocent, they're sinless, they don't inherit sin. They don't have any type of sinful nature. The Bible is clear on that matter. And without any question, we know that all those children ended up, we'll just say, to speak poetically, they all ended up in the bosom of God. All right? And we all believe that. But at the same time, there's still the text. There was a voice in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. What about those parents? But again, what kind of world would it be if God intervened every time somebody did something or tried to do something that was contrary to His will? In essence, it would keep you from having free will. Isn't that right? If every decision that I made was contrary to the will of God and God intervened and stopped me from doing that, it couldn't be rightfully said that I had free will, could it? No consequences. No consequences. And that's exactly where I was going, Wade, is that we suffer because of not only people making decisions contrary to the will of God, that sometimes people just make bad decisions, period. Make bad decisions, period. And sometimes we suffer the consequences of those decisions, and sometimes we don't. Is that right? Let me give you an example. 3 or 4 years ago, a big gum tree fell over on my farm, down on the back side of that house that's in the middle of my place, and it fell over into the pasture or the field itself. I think it was a gum tree. It might have been an oak tree. I can't remember. Doesn't matter. But anyway, I went down there to cut up that tree. I was going to cut some firewood, so it must have been an oak tree. It must have been an oak tree that fell. I'm going down there to cut some firewood. And there's a limb that appears to be just barely in the surface of the ground. And I put the chainsaw to that limb. All right, now I'm back here with that chainsaw, and I cut about halfway through that thing, and what happened? Man, that thing, it was actually jabbed way down into the ground, and when that thing broke, I mean, it came up at over 100 miles an hour. I'm talking about, and it just went right by my head. It went right by my head. If my head is over here, I'm dead as a hammer. Right? I mean, that thing's gonna clip me right in the jaw, and it's either gonna take my head off or it's gonna kill me. Now, that was a bad decision on my part, wasn't it? That was a bad decision on my part. Not to really, look into that. It was just careless, right? Sometimes bad things happen because we're careless. And sometimes we pay the price for that, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes other people pay the price for the careless acts of others. But what would happen if God intervened every time somebody committed a careless act? You don't learn anything. Who wants to live in a world where every single careless act is intervened by God? I mean, I don't. Just think about what you couldn't even hardly function in the world if every time something bad was fixing to happen, something had to stop and be corrected. You couldn't even function. Now, think about this. Have you ever let at raising children, did you ever let your children make bad decisions that you knew were not very good decisions, but you let them make it anyway?
Why'd you do that, Jeremiah? You knew it was a bad decision.
Tell them so many times, don't touch that heater, it's hot. And until they touch it and learn for themselves, they really don't know.
All right, just one example. You never, like Wade said, no consequences, or you never learn. Now, if they were fixing to do something that might really, really harm themselves, and you had the ability to do so, you would intervene. You know, but it's like, you know, the world we live in. If we're going to have free will, then bad things have to be allowed to happen. I was listening to Jordan Peterson yesterday, and he was talking to, I can't remember the guy's name, but they were talking about that, you know, people don't understand that everything that exists in the world has an opposite. Everything that exists in the world has an opposite, and we have to you know, wrap our minds around that. So, in other words, for every good there has to be a bad. In other words, if the good is not done, then the opposite takes place. And so if we're going to be free moral agents, then bad things have to be allowed to happen as a result of our poor choices. And God's not going to force us. God is not going to force us to obey Him, because then He'd have to override our free will. And it's not really obedience if I don't choose to do it of my own free will. You know, a computer does what the programmer programs it to do, right? I mean, you know, I've got a little old calculator on my desk. You know, I can hit 2 plus 2 a billion times on that thing. And every time I hit equals, what's it going to say? It's going to say 4. Because that's the way it's programmed. It can't do anything other than what it was programmed to do. And human beings aren't like that. And so, you know, the question about the slaughter of the innocents, you know, raises some real serious issues about free will and about, you know, the type of world that we want to live in. All right, I want to stop right there, because I've got a ton of material in this section that I've written down in regard to Jesus brought to Nazareth, and then Jesus in Nazareth and his visit to Jerusalem. So we'll pick up right there next time, and I'm going to go ahead and start handing out lessons 9 and 10. But our next class we'll finish lesson 8 and do the questions, and then be ready for 9 and 10. Better get that thing turned off.